Hello there guys, what is going on? Son of Chelsea back here again for another video, and as you can see by the title of today's video, I'm going to be giving you my Chelsea player ratings for 19-20. How do I rate each player in the squad from 1 to 10, going through that, some of my opinions and conclusions from their seasons. But before we get into any of that one, honestly guys, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Also hit that like button if you're enjoying the content because it helps out the channel as well. But let's get into my player ratings, ranking them out of 10. Just sort of my ranking system, sort of 1 to 4 I think is a really poor season. About 5 to about 7 I'd say is about an average season, and beyond that is a really good season in my opinion. Let's start with goalkeepers. Kepa. I'm going to give Kepa a 4 out of 10 for this season. I just think, even though I was probably quite sympathetic to Kepa over the season because I felt he had a really poor defence in front of him, I think the numbers just don't lie. I mean, whatever your opinions are on Kepa, and they are quite harsh, quite critical now. I think people have lost a lot of faith and trust in Kepa, and he will be moved on sooner rather than later at Chelsea. I just think when you look at the raw stats about this, I've gone through this in recent videos, they're really galling, they're really brutal for Kepa. You know, the worst keeper in the league in some XG metrics, and just in terms of stat and save percentage, just not good enough for a keeper who wants to play for Chelsea. And a lack of trust now. You know, I think it says a lot that Caballero took over in some of those big games at the end of the season, so I expect him to be off sooner rather than later. So I do think 4 out of 10 is a fair assessment, unfortunately. Moving on to Willy Caballero, I'm going to give Willy Caballero a 7 out of 10. I think he didn't do much wrong, to be honest. I think based on pre-season expectations for him, and I think for the rest of us, how much he would play this season, I think it went over expectation, probably because of Kepa's form and the lack of trust Frank Lampard had in him. I think his maturity and professionalism came through a lot. I think he helped the defence in times that was quite rocky. I think the semi-final against Man United proved that, and the Wolves game proved that as well. Of course, Willy Caballero is not a world-class goalkeeper. He's not going to solve Chelsea's problem in that area, but I think for a mature head back there, I think he was good when he was called on for Lampard. So I think 7 out of 10 is a fair assessment for his season. Let's move on now to defenders. Dave, I'm going to give Dave an 8 out of 10. One of the best performers for me this season for Chelsea. Consistency, Mr. Reliable really over a number of years for Chelsea. I mean, versatility as well. Once again, Dave having to play in 3 positions this season. He started at right back, moved over to left back during sort of the winter months when Frank was unsure about Marcus Alonso and Emerson, and then the back end of the season when Frank decided to play a 3-4-3, he reverted to that role that he played under Kante for. So I think that just shows you once again how reliable and how big of a part Dave has been for Chelsea's squad over a number of years. And I think that competition for Rhys James really helped. He had a real struggle at the start of the season, had some really difficult days, and I think there was a lot of us who thought, you know, is this the end for Dave here? But I think he's really reasserted himself and definitely made himself a regular starter under Lampard again. And I think it's going to be a massive tussle next year between him and Rhys James for who gets that #1 spot at right back. But he's a great player to have, even if this is going to be the last probably season at Chelsea for him. Moving on now to his competition in Rhys James. I'm going to give James a 7 out of 10. This was his breakthrough year. It really was. Of course, he didn't have a full pre-season, if you remember, being injured. Came in, I believe it was the Grimsby game in the League Cup, and he scored in that game. I think assisted in that game, and he's been really impressive. He really has. He's had some difficulties in terms of, for him defensively, I think is the thing he needs to work on, but offensively, creatively, it looks really exciting for Rhys James on that right side. I think he can definitely be a player that's going to dominate that area for a number of years for Chelsea, and is going to be essential to the way Frank Lampard wants to utilise his fullbacks moving forward. It helped Rhys James when we went to a 3-4-3 because of course he could play at right wing back with Dave behind him, but I definitely think next season is going to be a big year for Rhys James. So I think 7 out of 10, really impressed, one of the stars of Chelsea's youth revolution. Moving on now to centre backs, Antonio Rudiger, one of my favourite players in the squad, but I have to give him a 4 out of 10. He has had injury issues, and I do think you need to take that into consideration when you're assessing Antonio Rudiger's season. He completely missed pre-season, came back against Wolves, then got re-injured again, and didn't I think return till about December. So it's always going to be a difficult season for him to get back to his best fitness and form. But for me, big mistakes, naive mistakes as well from Rudy. I mean, for me, previous to this season, I thought Rudy was our best centre-back for at least the previous 2 seasons since he joined from Roma. Unfortunately, we just have not seen that side of him enough this season. I don't think you can eradicate that form before and say, you know, he was never a good defender for Chelsea. Unfortunately, this year, maybe mistakes, injuries, the uncertainty around that defence with Lampard now, and how much it needs to be restructured and improved, and especially with new players coming in. I think Rudy's just, for me, has been really disappointing this year. I think the big mistakes in big games has definitely cost us, as you saw in the FA Cup final. And and he's not as relied upon anymore, and he may not be a first team regular next season if Chelsea get the targets they want. So I think 4 out of 10, considering the high standards he set, this has really been underwhelming. So I think 4 out of 10 for him. Moving on now to Kurt Zouma, I'm going to give him a 7 out of 10. I think he was the best centre-back in a struggling defence. I think that's what most people feel. When he came back from Everton, I mean, there was a sense even maybe over a year ago now, people thought Zouma's Chelsea career was over because of circumstance. The transfer ban definitely helped him get back into the fray at Chelsea, and he became a consistent starter for Frank Lampard, especially at the start of the season. That's not to say Kurt Zouma is a perfect defender, but I think physically, aerially in the box for Chelsea, in both boxes, and passing too, I think is an underrated part of Kurt Zouma's game, to be honest. And he made some crucial tackles at the back end of the season for Chelsea, especially that Crystal Palace win, which helped us eventually secure Champions League football. So I think 7 out of 10 is good for him. I think Zouma's best period of the season was next to Fikayo Tomori, who I'm going to rate next. I'm going to give him a 7 out of 10. It's unfortunate with Tomori with injuries. Unfortunately, just halted his season. Really barely got any playing time in the remainder of the season. But you have to remember way back in September, October time, where he was a consistent starter alongside Kurt Zouma in Lampard's back four. For me, he was the best centre-back. He really showed promise that he could become a big player in Chelsea's defence. I think he had some big performances. The Ajax game, which of course he played alongside Kurt Zouma. Like all the youngsters I'm going to talk about, had mistakes, had naive moments, and I think he definitely struggled with injury and also going out the team. I remember Frank Lampard brought him back for a game away to Bournemouth, and he really struggled that day, and probably is someone that's not the most vocal presence, which is what Chelsea needed in our defence. But I definitely think, based on pre-season expectation, where he could have been loaned out if David Luiz hadn't have left for Arsenal, I think this was a big year for Fikayo Tomori. So hopefully he grows in the coming year. So I think 7 out of 10 once again is fair. Andreas Christensen, the last centre-back to rate this season, I'm going to give him a 5 out of 10. Only slightly better than Antonio Rudiger. I don't think there's much difference for them in truth. Inconsistency once again for Andreas Christensen. He just, some games he looks like he can be really good, really promising, really assertive. Then other games he can be physically outdone. There's a real weakness in his game, and I've said this a lot on the channel. I think, how long are Chelsea going to wait for Andreas Christensen to mature into the brilliant centre-back some people think he can be? I think that potential is clearly there, but unfortunately at the moment, just the way Frank Lampard needs to fix that defence, I just don't think Christensen is offering enough for me at the moment. I think next season is going to be big for him. If he does stay and does get into the first team, he has to break through and he has to make himself a regular starter. If he doesn't, I don't think he'll have a future at Chelsea, in my opinion, and I think he'll be sold sooner rather than later. Let's move on to left backs now. Emerson, same as Andreas Christensen, 5 out of 10. He had a really good start to the year, was one of Chelsea's best performers in that opening batch of games, if you remember, coming off the back of a good end to the year under Sarri as well, but lost Lampard's trust. I think he got an injury on international duty for Italy early in the season, and that really halted his season, and he came back in, made mistakes. I think the big moment for him in a negative sense was the home game against Arsenal, if you remember, where Bellerin scored that late equaliser. Really frustrating evening, and I think that basically it was a long gap between Emerson after that game, starting that game and playing a majority of that game, and starting again, which I don't think was till after Project Restart away to Leicester in the FA Cup, and I think that just showed you the trust Frank Lampard, the lack of trust Frank Lampard had in Emerson. A player that's definitely going to be off. This is going to be his last season at Chelsea. I think, like Marcos Alonso, he's really promising going forward, but defensively for me, too much of a liability. Probably better as a wing back, and unfortunately in a 4-3-3 system, he can be exposed too often, and his form is just too erratic for me. So I think this will be the end for Emerson. So I think 5 out of 10. Just didn't have a really strong year where he could have broken into the first team. And Marcos Alonso, I'm going to give slightly higher, a 6 out of 10. He was definitely much more useful in the later part of the season. And if you remember, when Emerson was injured, I think during our best winning run, Marcos Alonso played a majority of that game in a back four. But as well, a bit like Emerson, is still a liability in that back four. Think about the West Ham winner, the 3-2 game where he wasn't tracking back. And that's something Chelsea need to rectify this summer, and why Chelsea are going out there looking for a new left back. It's someone that can defend and attack in similar quality. And I think that's something Marcos Alonso struggles with. As we saw once again, he's a left wing back specialist. If you put him in the 3-4-3, he can be a brilliant asset going forward for Chelsea and scoring goals, which has always been a big part of his game. I'd like to see him stay for another season. I think he could be a good rotational player, especially if Frank wants to revert to a 3-4-3 at times, but definitely it's still a liability. So I think 6 out of 10 is a fair assessment on his season. 6 out of 10 as well for Georginio as we move into midfield. Was good in the first part of the season. I was really happy to see Georgie get support from the fans after last season under Sarri. That Watford pass, that was such a brilliant pass. Probably still Chelsea's pass of the season for Tammy Abraham there. But I think he definitely struggled as the season wore on, especially when Frank Lampard, we weren't quite sure what his midfield was going to look like. What was his main formation going to look like? And then post the restart, when Frank reverted to a 4-3-3 and played Kante as that holding midfielder, I think it became pretty evident that Frank wasn't going to really be using Georginio as much, to be honest. I think the only reason Georginio got back into the team was because of N'Golo Kante's fitness issues once again, which is going to be a problem next season. But I think it's something that shows you that Georginio probably hasn't got a long-term future under Frank Lampard based on the high pressing system he wants to play. But I think he definitely still had a decent year, but I think 6 out of 10, I think anything higher than that would be unfair and unrealistic based on his season, to be honest. So I still think he's got those major flaws that can be exposed in a certain system, and unfortunately I just don't think he suits Lampard's system anymore. Moving on now to N'Golo Kante, who's got 6 out of 10 as well. Injuries, that's the one thing I've got noted for N'Golo Kante's season. It's just unfortunate because in the times he did play, I think he looked really good, a world-class talent, probably the only world-class player Chelsea have in their first team squad, and you don't want to lose him, and hopefully his fitness will remain next season and be much better, because if it is, he can be a transformative player in Chelsea's midfield. We know that. We know the quality of N'Golo Kante, but it's just injury problems that have really halted this season for him, and it's hard to sort of assess because he was out for so long, never had a long period of season, and I think at times maybe there was uncertainty around Frank Lampard wanted from his midfield, which as I said with Georginio, I think was the same for N'Golo Kante, so 6 out of 10. Mateo Kovacic though is going to get a 9 out of 10. Consistency. I think Kovacic could win player of the season. I voted for Mateo Kovacic as my player of the season for Chelsea. I think it's fair. I think it's based on his season, how he's transformed under Frank Lampard. I think Frank has really got the best out of Kovacic. I think what he offers to our midfield in terms of press resistance, I think he's really come out of his shell this year, and I think that's the big thing for Kovacic. I don't know how big of a role he's going to play next season as Chelsea bring in new recruits in that area and Frank continues to sort of shape his vision, but I think he's a very useful player in the modern game. I think especially when teams press us high, I think the quality of Kovacic has definitely shone through, and he's had loads of big performances in big games for us this season. So I think 9 out of 10 based on pre-season expectation as well for Kovacic, I think is fair. So he's been one of our best performers, so I think that's a fair assessment. Mason Mount as well is going to get a 9 out of 10. Versatility, the amount he's played, how essential he's been to Frank Lampard this season cannot be underestimated. The style of football Frank Lampard wants to implement, a high pressing system, winning the ball high up the pitch. I mean, Mason Mount's first goal, Chelsea's first league goal of the season, perfectly demonstrated that against Leicester in August, where he dispossessed Wilfred Ndidi and scored, and that pretty much summed up Mason Mount's season. I also think his versatility to play in central midfield, left wing, also as an inverted winger and a 3-4-3. He scored some massive goals for Chelsea. The Wolves goal, which was the brilliant free kick on the final day of the Premier League season. I mean, if you were to pick Mason Mount as player of the season, I don't think that'd be an unfair assessment. I think he definitely will be probably young player of the season, but an essential player for Frank Lampard, really. The amount he's played this season, over 50 appearances, ridiculous for a player of his age, and how much he's adapted to it, dealt with the struggles and come back stronger, I think is really impressive. So Mason Mount, Money Mace, definitely deserves credit this season for me. Ross Barkley, I'm going to give a 7 out of 10, simply because I think it's better than what I expected from him in the summer. To be fair, he had a really strong pre-season, but unfortunately as the season got going, he returned to the previous Ross Barkley that we'd seen at Chelsea for the majority of the time, where he's indecisive, he thinks too much, inconsistent. I still think that's the case overall, but he did have some really good performances during the season, notably the Liverpool and Everton games in March just before lockdown hit. I mean, that's the unfortunate thing for Ross Barkley. Maybe when you think that if we hadn't have broke then and he continued playing for Chelsea, continued being a first team regular, could he have gone on to new heights? I mean, he did score a big goal for us against Leicester in the FA Cup quarter final, but I still think as a player that's just probably not good enough. I mean, squad player, yeah, is probably useful to have, and Frank has shown that he will use Ross at times off the bench. I definitely think he hasn't got a long-term future at Chelsea, to be honest, but I think 7 out of 10 based on what I expected from him. I think a better than average season really for me. I think he'll be happy with what he did during the season, but definitely for me still not sort of giving as much as probably we would want from someone in that position. Next, moving on to Billy Gilmour, who's going to get the same score, 7 out of 10. He was a surprise breakout, and I was unsure whether I should give Gilmour sort of a full assessment for the season, because he did break through so late on in the season, had a couple of sub appearances early on under Frank Lampard, and to be honest, of course, got that injury against Crystal Palace which ruled him out for the remainder of the game, so didn't play a lot in truth in comparison to other players, but I still wanted to give him a rating this season, and I think 7 out of 10 is fair. Those Liverpool and Everton performance were amazing. They really were. The maturity, the elegance of Gilmour that day definitely brought a balance to Chelsea's midfield in both of those games, which were amazing. They really were, and a bit like Ross Barkley, similar in a sense where doing amazingly well, and then we had lockdown, came back, and he just struggled post-lockdown, didn't he? I think at times, you know, Frank wanting to have Kante in the team as well. Gilmour, I think, looked off the pace at times. Definitely his age showing in a negative way. But he'll come back stronger. You know, he's got that injury, which is unfortunate, but he showed in those brief glimpses how big of a player he could be for Chelsea in the future. So the best is yet to come for Gilmour, and it was a breakthrough season for him, which is a positive. Let's move on now to wingers, and I'm going to talk about Willian. 8 out of 10 I'm going to give him. It's a little bit weird to talk about Willian now being, of course, an Arsenal player at the time of recording this video, but what a great way to go out for his Chelsea career. Definitely appreciated this season. I mean, Frank definitely leaned on his experience. He scored some massive goals. That Tottenham performance away from home was massive, and especially post-lockdown, one of our best creative players. He really was. The stats just showed how good he was for Chelsea, and it's going to be interesting to see how Chelsea cope post-Willian. You know, I think he's a player that probably has been underappreciated over the years by some sections of fans, and I really hope that doesn't come back to bite Chelsea next season, but I think he's a player that will be missed and has been greatly appreciated by me. I've made a lot of videos recently talking about his career, how good he's been, so I think for him to go out as good as he did this season, I think is really good for him and his Chelsea career, how fans will remember him. So 8 out of 10, one of the best performers this year, and I think he deserves that score. Pedro, another player to be moving on this summer to Roma. I'm going to give him a 5 out of 10, just did not play enough. He played a little bit before lockdown, I believe against Everton and Liverpool, wasn't it? And he scored against Everton, but just once again, played a little bit at the start of the season, but once the likes of Pulisic, Willian, HUDSON-ODOI at times got minutes, he just really was out of the team for the majority of the season, really. And of course, we knew his time at Chelsea would be coming to an end, so I think 5 out of 10 is fair. Christian Pulisic, like Kovacic and Mason Mount, I'm going to give him a 9 out of 10 because I think he deserves it. A stunning first season as a Chelsea player. Of course, he had a real struggle at the start, you know, of course, not being in the team. I think didn't play a minute of Premier League football in September. And of course, there were all these concerns about whether Frank Lampard trusted Christian Pulisic, but then he had that autumn breakthrough. I think he came off the bench against Newcastle and helped to set up the winner there, set up the winner against Ajax in that amazing win. And of course, that Burnley, that brilliant individual performance against Burnley. I think he's had those injury struggles. He's had to come back post-lockdown. He was incredible. He went to a new level. He was a game changer for Chelsea, becoming our best player in those final games, really helping us get over the line for Champions League qualification. And I think even though, of course, that injury is probably going to knock him back a little bit, I think what you see there is a stunning individual with stunning quality that can change games for Chelsea in a moment. So I think next season is going to be massive for him, and it's going to be really exciting to see how he deals next season, hopefully with better fitness, because I think he's going to dominate Chelsea's left. Let's move on now to Callum HudsonOdoi. I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10. Quite an underwhelming season, injury stricken again. This is so like the case for so many players this year. Injury problems for Chelsea has been a big problem for a number of players getting that consistency. But I thought he had a strong start when he came back from injury in September, October time. He played well during there, but definitely struggled post then. Had some decent showings as the season went on, but I think really struggled, and hopefully, a bit like some other players, having fitness now going into next season with Willian and Pedro leaving, a chance to break into the first team again under Frank Lampard. I really hope next season Callum HudsonOdoi has a big year. He's still a young player, got loads of potential, but I think 6 out of 10 is a fair assessment on 1920 for him. Tammy Abraham, moving on to the strikers. Tammy's going to get an 8 out of 10. He surpassed preseason expectations, 18 goals, considering that's only, 2 away from Diego Costa's tally in his first season as a Chelsea striker. Truly stunning, and I think Tammy definitely dominated the first part of the season for Chelsea. He scored a bundle of goals. That Wolves performance, that hat-trick was incredible. The goals against, especially Arsenal, that winner, I think was probably maybe his biggest goal of the season in truth, but definitely scored some big goals around that time as well, and we relied on his pace, his finishing, his all-round play, which I think improved over time. Unfortunately for him, of course, injuries once again and form definitely deteriorated in the second part of the season, and we relied on another striker to help us get over the line. But I think Tammy showed huge potential this year, and Frank definitely relied on him. The way he came back from certain setbacks during the season was really impressive. So I think another player that definitely has got the best yet to come, and I think definitely proved this year why he could be a big striker for Chelsea in the future. Final 2 players to rate then. Olivier Giroud, 8 out of 10, hero of the second half of the season. What an incredible story for Olivier Giroud this season. Everyone thought he'd be off. He packed his bag. He was going to be off to Italy. He stayed. Chelsea didn't sign a new striker, and then he scored a bundle of goals for us that helped us get over the line in Champions League qualification. I think the professionalism is something that really came to the fore this year, especially in that first half of the season, which would have been difficult for a player like Olivier Giroud. But I think you saw the quality of him in that second part of the season, especially the run-in, where he scored some big goals for us in difficult occasions. His link-up play, his hold-up play, just the nous and experience of Giroud came to the fore, and Frank Lampard definitely benefited of it, and he really helped Chelsea get over the line. So I think I cannot give enough credit to Olivier Giroud. What a start for Chelsea in those remaining games. Good to see him staying, getting that contract extension. And finally, Michy Batshuayi. Unfortunately, I am finishing on a negative 3 out of 10, my lowest score this year. I felt this was his last chance to break into the first team and become Chelsea's main striker. I felt he had the best opportunity he's ever had at Chelsea last summer when Frank Lampard arrived. You know, you see Tammy Abraham coming in as a young striker, don't really know how he's going to adapt to being a Chelsea striker and the pressure that comes with that. Olivier Giroud, of course, we knew, but I think he surpassed expectation as well this year. But Michy, even though he had certain decent moments like scoring another big winner against Ajax, I think you saw once again why many coaches have never really backed Michy Batshuayi at Chelsea. Just does not link up well with other players, which is a big component of being a Chelsea striker. It's not just about scoring goals, you're all-round play and link-up play as well, which unfortunately Michy just does not have. And I think that Man United game at home, that defeat in February, where he missed a couple of big chances, I think was the end for him really. Hasn't played since, will definitely be off on a loan or a permanent move, and that'll be the end for him at Stamford Bridge. Has given some good moments, some big goals over the years, even though he hasn't always been the main man, but I think just disappointing his form this year, just never really took the chances that were given to him. But that is it for my Chelsea player ratings for 1920. Please let me know your opinions and your player ratings in the comments below. But thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Follow me on Twitter at Son of Chelsea, and I'll see you again.